Chapter 19 of Dombey and Son. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cynthia Lyons. Dombey and Son by Charles Dickens. Chapter 19. Walter Goes Away. The wooden midshipman at the instrument-maker's door, like the hard-hearted little midshipman he was, remained supremely indifferent to Walter's going away, even when the very last day of his sojourn in the back parlour was on the decline. With his quadrant at his round black knob of an eye, and his figure in its old attitude of indomitable alacrity, the midshipman displayed his elfin small clothes to the best advantage, and, absorbed in scientific pursuits, had no sympathy with worldly concerns. He was so far the creature of circumstances that a dry day covered him with dust, and a misty day peppered him with little bits of soot, and a wet day brightened up his tarnished uniform for the moment, and a very hot day blistered him. But otherwise he was a callous, obdurate, conceited midshipman, intent on his own discoveries, and caring as little for what went on about him terrestrially as Archimedes at the taking of Syracuse. Such a midshipman he seemed to be, at least, in the then position of domestic affairs. Walter eyed him kindly many a time in passing in and out, and poor old Sol, when Walter was not there, would come and lean against the door-post, resting his weary wig as near the shoe-buckles of the guardian genius of his trade and shop as he could. But no fierce idol with a mouth from ear to ear and a murderous visage made of parrot's feathers was ever more indifferent to the appeals of its savage votaries than was the midshipman to these marks of attachment. Walter's heart felt heavy as he looked round his old bedroom up among the parapets and chimney-pots, and thought that one more night already darkening would close his acquaintance with it, perhaps for ever. Dismantled of his little stock of books and pictures, it looked coldly and reproachfully on him for his desertion, and had already a foreshadowing upon it of its coming strangeness. A few hours more, thought Walter, and no dream I ever had here when I was a schoolboy will be so little mine as this old room. The dream may come back in my sleep, and I may return waking to this place, it may be. But the dream at least will serve no other master, and the room may have a score, and every one of them may change, neglect, misuse it. But his uncle was not to be left alone in the little back parlour, where he was then sitting by himself, for Captain Cuttle, considerate in his roughness, stayed away against his will, purposely that they should have some talk together unobserved. So Walter, newly returned home from his last day's bustle, descended briskly to bear him company. "Uncle," he said gaily, laying his hand upon the old man's shoulder, "what shall I send you home from Barbados?" "Hope, my dear Wally, hope that we shall meet again, on this side of the grave. Send me as much of that as you can." "So I will, uncle. I have enough and to spare, and I'll not be chary of it. And as to lively turtles and limes for Captain Cuttle's punch, and preserves for you on Sunday, and all that sort of thing, why, I'll send you shiploads, uncle, when I'm rich enough." Old Sol wiped his spectacles and faintly smiled. "That's right, uncle," cried Walter merrily, and clapping him half a dozen times more upon the shoulder. "You cheer me up, I'll cheer you. We'll be as gay as larks to-morrow morning, uncle, and we'll fly as high. As to my anticipations, they are singing out of sight now." "Wally, my dear boy," returned the old man, "I'll do my best. I'll do my best." "And your best, uncle," said Walter, with his pleasant laugh, "is the best that I know. You'll not forget what you're to send me, uncle." "No, Wally, no," replied the old man. "Everything I hear about Miss Dombey, now that she is left alone, poor lamb. I'll write. I fear it won't be much, though, Wally." "Why, I'll tell you what, uncle," said Walter, after a moment's hesitation. "I have just been up there." "Ay," murmured the old man, raising his eyebrows and his spectacles with them. "Not to see her," said Walter, "though I could have seen her, I dare say, if I had asked, Mr. Dombey being out of town, but to say a parting word to Susan. I thought I might venture to do that, you know, under the circumstances, and remembering when I saw Miss Dombey last." "Yes, my boy, yes," replied his uncle, rousing himself from a temporary abstraction. "So I saw her," pursued Walter, "Susan, I mean, and I told her I was off and away to-morrow. And I said, uncle, that you had always had an interest in Miss Dombey since that night when she was here, and always wished her well and happy, and always would be proud and glad to serve her in the least. I thought I might say that, you know, under the circumstances. Don't you think so?" "Yes, my boy, yes," replied his uncle in the tone as before. "And I added," pursued Walter, "that if she, Susan I mean, could ever let you know, either through herself or Mrs Richards, or anybody else who might be coming this way, that Miss Dombey was well and happy, you would take it very kindly, and would write so much to me, and I should take it very kindly too. There, upon my word, uncle," said Walter, "I scarcely slept all last night through thinking of doing this, and could not make up my mind when I was out, whether to do it or not. And yet I am sure it is the true feeling of my heart, and I should have been quite miserable afterwards if I had not relieved it." His honest voice and manner corroborated what he said, and quite established its ingenuousness. "So, if you ever see her, uncle," said Walter, "I mean Miss Dombey now, and perhaps you may, who knows, tell her how much I felt for her, how much I used to think of her when I was here, how I spoke of her, with the tears in my eyes, uncle, on this last night before I went away. Tell her that I said I never could forget her gentle manner, or her beautiful face, or her sweet kind disposition that was better than all. And as I didn't take them from a woman's feet or a young lady's, only a little innocent child's," said Walter. "Tell her, if you don't mind, uncle, that I kept those shoes she'll remember how often they fell off that night, and took them away with me as a remembrance." They were at that very moment going out at the door in one of Walter's trunks. A porter carrying off his baggage on a truck for shipment to the docks on board the Son and Heir had got possession of them, and wheeled them away under the very eye of the insensible midshipman before their owner had well finished speaking. But that ancient mariner might have been excused his insensibility to the treasure as it rolled away, for under his eye at the same moment, accurately within his range of observation, coming full into the sphere of his startled and intensely wide-awake look-out, were Florence and Susan Nipper. Florence looking up into his face half timidly, and receiving the whole shock of his wooden oogling. More than this, they passed into the shop and passed in at the parlour door before they were observed by anybody but the midshipman. And Walter, having his back to the door, would have known nothing of their apparition even then, but for seeing his uncle spring out of his own chair and nearly tumble over another. "Why, uncle!" exclaimed Walter, "what's the matter?" Old Solomon replied, "Miss Dombey!" "Is it possible?" cried Walter, looking round and starting up in his turn. "Here?" Why, it was so possible and so actual that while the words were on his lips, Florence hurried past him, took Uncle Sol's snuff-colored lapels, one in each hand, kissed him on the cheek, and turning, gave her hand to Walter with a simple truth and earnestness that was her own and no one else's in the world. "Going away, Walter?" said Florence. "Yes, Miss Dombey," he replied, but not so hopefully as he endeavoured. "I have a voyage before me." "And your uncle," said Florence, looking back at Solomon. "He is sorry you are going, I am sure." "Ah, I see he is. Dear Walter, I am very sorry too." "Goodness knows," exclaimed Miss Nipper, "there's a many we could spare instead, if numbers is a object. Mrs. Pipchin as a overseer would come cheap at her weight in gold, and if a knowledge of black slavery should be required, then Blimbers is the very people for the situation." With that, Miss Nipper untied her bonnet strings, and after looking vacantly for some moments into a little black teapot that was set forth with the usual homely service on the table, shook her head and a tin canister, and began unasked to make the tea. In the meantime, Florence had turned again to the instrument maker, who was as full of admiration as surprise. "So grown," said old Sol, "so improved, and yet not altered. Just the same." "Indeed," said Florence. "Yes," returned old Sol, rubbing his hands slowly and considering the matter half aloud, as something pensive in the bright eyes looking at him arrested his attention. Yes, that expression was in the younger face too. "You remember me?" said Florence with a smile. "And what a little creature I was then." "My dear lady," returned the instrument maker, "how could I forget you, often as I have thought of you and heard of you since? At the very moment, indeed, when you came in, Wally was talking about you to me, and leaving messages for you, and—" "Was he?" said Florence. "Thank you, Walter. Oh, thank you, Walter. I was afraid you might be going away and hardly thinking of me." And again she gave him her little hand so freely and so faithfully that Walter held it for some moments in his own, and could not bear to let it go. Yet Walter did not hold it as he might have held it once, nor did its touch awaken those old daydreams of his boyhood that had floated past him sometimes even lately, and confused him with their indistinct and broken shapes. The purity and innocence of her endearing manner, and its perfect trustfulness, and the undisguised regard for him that lay so deeply seated in her constant eyes, and glowed upon her fair face through the smile that shaded, for alas, it was a smile too sad to brighten, it were not of their romantic race. They brought back to his thoughts the early deathbed he had seen her tending, and the love the child had borne her, and on the wings of such remembrance she seemed to rise up, far above his idle fancies, into clearer and serener air. I am afraid I must call you Walter's uncle, sir," said Florence to the old man, "if you let me." "My dear young lady," cried old Sol, "let you? Good gracious!" "We always knew you by that name, and talked of you," said Florence, glancing round and sighing gently. "The nice old parlour, just the same. How well I recollect it." Old Sol looked first at her, then at his nephew, and then rubbed his hands and rubbed his spectacles, and said below his breath, "Ah, time, time, time." There was a short silence, during which Susan Nipper skilfully impounded 2 extra cups and saucers from the cupboard, and awaited the drawing of the tea with a thoughtful air. "I want to tell Walter's uncle," said Florence, laying her hand timidly upon the old man's as it rested on the table, to bespeak his attention, "something that I am anxious about. He is going to be left alone, and if he will allow me not to take Walter's place, for that I couldn't do, but to be his true friend and help him if I ever can while Walter is away. I shall be very much obliged to him indeed. Will you? May I, Walter's uncle?" The instrument maker, without speaking, put her hand to his lips, and Susan Nipper, leaning back with her arms crossed, in the chair of presidency into which she had voted herself, bit one end of her bonnet strings and heaved a gentle sigh as she looked up at the skylight. "You will let me come to see you," said Florence, "when I can, and you will tell me everything about yourself and Walter, and you will have no secrets from Susan when she comes and I do not, but will confide in us and trust us and rely upon us, and you'll try to let us be a comfort to you. Will you, Walter's uncle?" The sweet face looking into his, the gentle pleading eyes, the soft voice, and the light touch on his arm made the more winning by a child's respect and honour for his age, that gave to all an air of graceful doubt and modest hesitation. These, and her natural earnestness, so overcame the poor old instrument maker that he only answered, "Wally, say a word for me, my dear. I'm very grateful." "No, Walter," returned Florence, with her quiet smile. "Say nothing for him, if you please. I understand him very well, and we must learn to talk together without you, dear Walter." The regretful tone in which she said these latter words touched Walter more than all the rest. "Miss Florence," he replied, with an effort to recover the cheerful manner he had preserved while talking with his uncle, "I know no more than my uncle what to say in acknowledgment of such kindness, I am sure. But what could I say, after all, if I had the power of talking for an hour, except that it is like you?" Susan Nipper began upon a new part of her bonnet string, and nodded at the skylight, in approval of this sentiment expressed. "Oh, but Walter," said Florence, "there is something that I wish to say to you before you go away, and you must call me Florence, if you please, and not speak like a stranger." "Like a stranger!" returned Walter. "No, I couldn't speak so. I am sure, at least, I couldn't feel like one." "Ay, but that is not enough, and is not what I mean. For Walter," added Florence, bursting into tears, "he liked you very much, and said, before he died, that he was fond of you, and said, 'Remember Walter, and if you'll be a brother to me, Walter, now that he is gone, and I have none on earth, I'll be your sister all my life, and think of you like one wherever we may be.' This is what I wish to say, dear Walter, but I cannot say it as I would, because my heart is full." And in its fullness and sweet simplicity she held out both her hands to him. Walter, taking them, stooped down and touched the tearful face that neither shrunk nor turned away, nor reddened as he did so, but looked up at him with confidence and truth. In that one moment every shadow of doubt or agitation passed away from Walter's soul. It seemed to him that he responded to her innocent appeal beside the dead child's bed, and in the solemn presence he had seen there, pledged himself to cherish and protect her very image, in his banishment, with brotherly regard, to garner up her simple faith inviolate, and hold himself degraded if he breathed upon it any thought that was not in her own breast when she gave it to him. Susan Nipper, who had bitten both her bonnet strings at once, and imparted a great deal of private emotion to the skylight, during this transaction, now changed the subject by inquiring who took milk and who took sugar, and being enlightened on these points, poured out the tea. They all four gathered socially about the little table and took tea under the young lady's active superintendence, and the presence of Florence in the back parlour brightened the Tartar frigate on the wall. Half an hour ago Walter, for his life, would have hardly called her by her name, but he could do so now when she entreated him. He could think of her being there without a lurking misgiving that it would have been better if she had not come. He could calmly think how beautiful she was, how full of promise, what a home some happy man would find in such a heart one day. He could reflect upon his own place in that heart with pride, and with a brave determination, if not to deserve it, he still thought that far above him, never to deserve it less. Some fairy influence must surely have hovered round the hands of Susan Nipper when she made the tea, engendering the tranquil air that reigned in the back parlour during its discussion. Some counter-influence must surely have hovered round the hands of Uncle Sol's chronometer and moved them faster than the target frigate ever went before the wind. Be this as it may, visitors had a coach in waiting at the quiet corner not far off, and the chronometer, on being incidentally referred to, gave such a positive opinion that it had been waiting a long time, that it was impossible to doubt the fact, especially when stated on such unimpeachable authority. If Uncle Sol had been going to be hanged by his own time, he never would have allowed that the chronometer was too fast, by the least fraction of a second. Florence, at parting, recapitulated to the old man all that she had said before, and bound him to their compact. Uncle Sol attended her lovingly to the legs of the wooden midshipman, and there resigned her to Walter, who was ready to escort her and Susan Nipper to the coach. "Walter," said Florence by the way, "I have been afraid to ask you before your uncle. Do you think you will be absent very long?" "Indeed," said Walter, "I don't know. I fear so. Mr. Dombey signified as much, I thought, when he appointed me." "Is it a favour, Walter?" inquired Florence, after a moment's hesitation, and looking anxiously in his face. "The appointment?" returned Walter. "Yes." Walter would have given anything to have answered in the affirmative, but his face answered before his lips could, and Florence was too attentive to it not to understand its reply. "I am afraid you have scarcely been a favourite with papa," she said timidly. "There is no reason," replied Walter, smiling, "why I should be." "No reason, Walter?" "There was no reason," said Walter, understanding what she meant. "There are many people employed in the house. Between Mr. Dombey and a young man like me, there's a wide space of separation. If I do my duty, I do what I ought, and do no more than all the rest." Had Florence any misgivings of which she was hardly conscious, any misgivings that had sprung into an indistinct and undefined existence since that recent night when she had gone down to her father's room, that Walter's accidental interest in her, and early knowledge of her, might have involved him in that powerful displeasure and dislike? Had Walter any such idea, or any sudden thought that it was in her mind at that moment? Neither of them hinted at it. Neither of them spoke at all for some short time. Susan, walking on the other side of Walter, eyed them both sharply, and certainly Miss Nipper's thoughts travelled in that direction, and very confidently too. "You may come back very soon," said Florence. "Perhaps, Walter." "I may come back," said Walter, "an old man, and find you an old lady, but I hope for better things." "Papa," said Florence, after a moment, will recover from his grief, and speak more freely to me one day, perhaps; and if he should, I will tell him how much I wish to see you back again, and ask him to recall you for my sake." There was a touching modulation in these words about her father, that Walter understood too well. The coach being close at hand, he would have left her without speaking, for now he felt what parting was. But Florence held his hand when she was seated, and then found there was a little packet in her own. "Walter," she said, looking full upon him with her affectionate eyes, Like you, I hope for better things. I will pray for them, and believe that they will arrive. I made this little gift for Paul. Pray take it with my love, and do not look at it until you are gone away. And now, God bless you, Walter. Never forget. You are my brother, dear." He was glad that Susan Nipper came between them, or he might have left her with a sorrowful remembrance of him. He was glad, too, that she did not look out of the coach again, but waved the little hand to him instead, as long as he could see it. In spite of her request, he could not help opening the packet that night when he went to bed. It was a little purse, and there was money in it. Bright rose the sun next morning from his absence in strange countries, and up rose Walter with it to receive the captain, who was already at the door, having turned out earlier than was necessary in order to get under way while Mrs. McStinger was yet slumbering. The captain pretended to be in tip-top spirits, and brought a very smoky tongue in one of the pockets of the broad blue coat for breakfast. "And, Walter," said the captain when they took their seats at table, "if your uncle's the man I think him, he'll bring out the last bottle of the Madeira on the present occasion." "No, no, Ned," returned the old man. "No, that shall be opened when Walter comes home again." "Well said!" cried the captain. "Hear him?" "There it lies," said Sol Gills, "down in the little cellar covered with dust and cobwebs." "There may be dirt and cobwebs over you and me, perhaps, Ned, before it sees the light." "Hear him!" cried the captain. "Good morality, Walter, my lad. Train up a fig tree in the way it should go, and when you are old, sit under the shade on it. Overhaul the well," said the captain on second thoughts, "I ain't quite certain where that's to be found, but when found, make a note of. Sol Gills, heave ahead again." "But there or somewhere it shall lie, Ned, until Wally comes back to claim it," says the old man. "That's all I meant to say." "And well said, too," returned the captain. "And if we three don't crack that bottle in company, I'll give you two leave to drink my allowance." Notwithstanding the captain's excessive joviality, he made but a poor hand at the smoky tongue, though he tried very hard, when anybody looked at him, to appear as if he were eating with a vast appetite. He was terribly afraid, likewise, of being left alone with either uncle or nephew, appearing to consider that his only chance of safety as to keeping up appearances was in their being always three together. This terror on the part of the captain reduced him to such ingenious evasions as running to the door when Solomon went to put his coat on, under pretence of having seen an extraordinary hackney coach pass, and darting out into the road when Walter went upstairs to take leave of the lodgers, on a feint of smelling fire in a neighbouring chimney. These artifices Captain Cuttle deemed inscrutable by any uninspired observer. Walter was coming down from his parting expedition upstairs, and was crossing the shop to go back to the little parlour, when he saw a faded face he knew, looking in at the door, and darted towards it. "Mr. Carker!" cried Walter, pressing the hand of John Carker the junior. "Pray come in. This is kind of you to be here so early to say good-bye to me. You knew how glad it would make me to shake hands with you once before going away. I cannot say how glad I am to have this opportunity. Pray come in." "It is not likely that we may ever meet again, Walter," returned the other, gently resisting his invitation, "and I am glad of this opportunity too. I may venture to speak to you, and to take you by the hand, on the eve of separation. I shall not have to resist your frank approaches, Walter, any more." There was a melancholy in his smile as he said it that showed he had found some company and friendship for his thoughts even in that. "Ah, Mr. Carker," returned Walter, "why did you resist them? You could have done me nothing but good, I am very sure." He shook his head. "If there were any good," he said, "I could do on this earth, I would do it, Walter, for you. The sight of you from day to day has been at once happiness and remorse to me. But the pleasure has outweighed the pain. I know that now, by knowing what I lose." "Come in, Mr. Carker, and make acquaintance with my old uncle," urged Walter. "I have often talked to him about you, and he will be glad to tell you all he hears from me." "I have not," said Walter, noticing his hesitation and speaking with embarrassment himself. "I have not told him anything about our last conversation, Mr. Carker, not even him, believe me." The grey junior pressed his hand, and tears rose in his eyes. "If I ever make acquaintance with him, Walter," he returned, "it will be that I may hear tidings of you. Rely on my not wronging your forbearance and consideration. It would be to wrong it not to tell him all the truth before I sought a word of confidence from him. But I have no friend or acquaintance except you, and even for your sake am little likely to make any." "I wish," said Walter, "you had suffered me to be your friend. Indeed, I always wished it, Mr. Carker, as you know, but never half so much as now, when we are going to part." "It is enough," replied the other, "that you have been the friend of my own breast, and that when I have avoided you most, my heart inclined the most towards you, and was fullest of you. Walter, good-bye." "Good-bye, Mr. Carker. Heaven be with you, sir," cried Walter, with emotion. "If," said the other, retaining his hand while he spoke, "if, when you come back, you miss me from my old corner, and should hear from any one where I am lying, come and look upon my grave. Think that I might have been as honest and as happy as you, and let me think, when I know my time is coming on, that some one like my former self may stand there for a moment, and remember me with pity and forgiveness. Walter, good-bye." His figure crept like a shadow down the bright sunlighted street, so cheerful yet so solemn in the early summer morning, and slowly passed away. The relentless chronometer at last announced that Walter must turn his back upon the wooden midshipman, and away they went, himself, his uncle, and the captain, in a hackney coach, to a wharf, where they were to take steamboat for some reach down the river, the name of which, as the captain gave it out, was a hopeless mystery to the ears of landsmen. Arrived at this reach, whither the ship had repaired by last night's tide, they were boarded by various excited watermen, and among others by a dirty Cyclops of the captain's acquaintance, who, with his one eye, had made the captain out some mile and a half off, and had been exchanging unintelligible roars with him ever since. Becoming the lawful prize of this personage, who was frightfully hoarse and constitutionally in want of shaving, they were all three put aboard the Son and Heir. And the Son and Heir was in a pretty state of confusion, with sails lying all bedraggled on the wet decks, loose ropes tripping people up, men in red shirts running barefoot to and fro, casks blockading every foot of space, and, in the thickest of the fray, a black cook in a black caboose up to his eyes in vegetables and blinded with smoke. The captain immediately drew Walter into a corner, and with great effort, that made his face very red, pulled up the silver watch, which was so big and so tight in his pocket that it came out like a bung. "Walter," said the captain, handing it over and shaking him heartily by the hand, "a parting gift, my lad. Put it back half an hour every morning, and about another quarter towards the afternoon, and it's a watch that'll do you credit." "Captain Cuttle, I couldn't think of it," cried Walter, detaining him, for he was running away. "Pray take it back. I have one already." "Then, Walter," said the captain, suddenly diving into one of his pockets, and bringing up the 2 teaspoons and the sugar tongs with which he had armed himself to meet such an objection, "take this here trifle of plate instead." "No, no, I couldn't indeed," cried Walter. "A thousand thanks. Don't throw them away, Captain Cuttle," for the captain was about to jerk them overboard. "They'll be of much more use to you than me. Give me your stick. I have often thought that I should like to have it. There. Good bye, Captain Cuttle. Take care of my uncle. Uncle Sol, God bless you." They were over the side in the confusion before Walter caught another glimpse of either, and when he ran up to the stern and looked after them, he saw his uncle hanging down his head in the boat, and Captain Cuttle rapping him on the back with the great silver watch (it must have been very painful), and gesticulating hopefully with the teaspoons and sugar tongs. Catching sight of Walter, Captain Cuttle dropped the property into the bottom of the boat with perfect unconcern, being evidently oblivious of its existence, and pulling off the glazed hat, hailed him lustily. The glazed hat made quite a show in the sun with its glistening, and the captain continued to wave it until he could be seen no longer. Then the confusion on board, which had been rapidly increasing, reached its height. 2 or 3 other boats went away with a cheer. The sails shone bright and full above as Walter watched them spread their surface to the favourable breeze. The water flew in sparkles from the prow, and off upon her voyage went the Son and Heir, as hopefully and trippingly as many another son and heir gone down had started on his way before her. Day after day, old Sol and Captain Cuttle kept her reckoning in the little back parlour and worked out her course, with the chart spread before them on the round table. At night, when old Sol climbed upstairs, so lonely, to the attic where it sometimes blew great guns, he looked up at the stars and listened to the wind, and kept a longer watch than would have fallen to his lot on board the ship. The last bottle of the old Madeira, which had its cruising days and had known its dangers of the deep, lay silently beneath its dust and cobwebs in the meanwhile, undisturbed. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Dombey and Son. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cynthia Lyons. Dombey and Son by Charles Dickens. Chapter 20. Mr. Dombey Goes Upon a Journey. "Mr. Dombey, sir," said Major Bagstock, "Joey B. is not in general a man of sentiment, for Joseph is tough, but Joe has his feelings, sir, and when they are awakened—" "Damme, Mr. Dombey," cried the Major with sudden ferocity, "this is weakness, and I won't submit to it." Major Bagstock delivered himself of these expressions on receiving Mr. Dombey as his guest at the head of his own staircase in Princess's Place. Mr. Dombey had come to breakfast with the Major previous to their setting forth on their trip, and the ill-starred native had already undergone a world of misery arising out of the muffins, while, in connection with the general question of boiled eggs, life was a burden to him. "It is not for an old soldier of the Bagstock breed," observed the Major, relapsing into a mild state, "to deliver himself up a prey to his own emotions, but, damme, sir," cried the Major, in another spasm of ferocity, "I condole with you." The Major's purple visage deepened in its hue, and the Major's lobster eyes stood out in bolder relief as he shook Mr. Dombey by the hand, imparting to that peaceful action as defiant a character as if it had been the prelude to his immediately boxing Mr. Dombey for £1,000 a side and the championship of England.
With a rotatory motion of his head, and a wheeze very like the cough of a horse, the Major then conducted his visitor to the sitting-room, and there welcomed him, having now composed his feelings, with the freedom and frankness of a travelling companion. "Dombey," said the Major, "I'm glad to see you. I'm proud to see you. There are not many men in Europe to whom J. Bagstock would say that. For Josh is blunt, sir, it's his nature, but Joey B. is proud to see you, Dombey." "Major," returned Mr. Dombey, "you are very obliging." "No, sir," said the Major, "devil a bit. That's not my character. If that had been Joe's character, Joe might have been by this time Lieutenant General Sir Joseph Bagstock, K.C.B., and might have received you in very different quarters. You don't know old Joe yet, I find. But this occasion, being special, is a source of pride to me. By the Lord, sir," said the Major resolutely, "it's an honour to me." Mr. Dombey, in his estimation of himself and his money, felt that this was very true, and therefore did not dispute the point. But the instinctive recognition of such a truth by the Major, and his plain avowal of it, were very agreeable. It was a confirmation to Mr. Dombey, if he had required any, of his not being mistaken in the Major. It was an assurance to him that his power extended beyond his own immediate sphere, and that the Major, as an officer and a gentleman, had a no less becoming sense of it than the beadle of the Royal Exchange. And if it were ever consolatory to know this, or the like of this, it was consolatory then, when the impotence of his will, the instability of his hopes, the feebleness of wealth, had been so direly impressed upon him. What could it do? His boy had asked him. Sometimes, thinking of the baby question, he could hardly forbear inquiring himself what could it do indeed? What had it done? But these were lonely thoughts, bred late at night in the sullen despondency and gloom of his retirement, and pride easily found its reassurance in many testimonies to the truth, as unimpeachable and precious as the Major's. Mr. Dombey, in his friendlessness, inclined to the Major. It cannot be said that he warmed towards him, but he thawed a little. The Major had had some part, and not too much, in the days by the seaside. He was a man of the world, and knew some great people. He talked much, and told stories, and Mr. Dombey was disposed to regard him as a choice spirit who shone in society, and who had not that poisonous ingredient of poverty, with which choice spirits in general are too much adulterated. His station was undeniable. Although the Major was a creditable companion, well accustomed to a life of leisure, and to such places as that they were about to visit, and having an air of gentlemanly ease about him that mixed well enough with his own city character, and did not compete with it at all. If Mr. Dombey had any lingering idea that the Major, as a man accustomed, in the way of his calling, to make light of the ruthless hand that had lately crushed his hopes, might unconsciously impart some useful philosophy to him and scare away his weak regrets, he hid it from himself, and left it lying at the bottom of his pride, unexamined. "Where is my scoundrel?" said the Major, looking wrathfully round the room. The native, who had no particular name, but answered to any vituperative epithet, presented himself instantly at the door, and ventured to come no nearer. "You villain!" said the choleric Major. "Where's the breakfast?" The dark servant disappeared in search of it, and was quickly heard reascending the stairs in such a tremulous state that the plates and dishes on the tray he carried, trembling sympathetically as he came, rattled again all the way up. "Dombey," said the Major, glancing at the native as he arranged the table, and encouraging him with an awful shake of his fist when he upset a spoon. "Here is a devilled grill, a savoury pie, a dish of kidneys, and so forth. Pray sit down. Old Joe can give you nothing but camp fare, you see." "Very excellent fare, Major," replied his guest, and not in mere politeness either, for the Major always took the best possible care of himself, and indeed ate rather more of rich meats than was good for him, insomuch that his imperial complexion was mainly referred by the faculty to that circumstance. "You have been looking over the way, sir," observed the Major. "Have you seen our friend?" "You mean Miss Tox?" retorted Mr. Dombey. "No." "Charming woman, sir," said the Major, with a fat laugh rising in his short throat and nearly suffocating him. "Miss Tox is a very good sort of person, I believe," replied Mr. Dombey. The haughty coldness of the reply seemed to afford Major Bagstock infinite delight. He swelled and swelled exceedingly, and even laid down his knife and fork for a moment to rub his hands. "Old Joe, sir," said the Major, "was a bit of a favourite in that quarter once, but Joe has had his day. J. Bagstock is extinguished, outrivalled, floored, sir." "I should have supposed," Mr. Dombey replied, "that the ladies' day for favourites was over. But perhaps you are jesting, Major." "Perhaps you are jesting, Dombey," was the Major's rejoinder. There never was a more unlikely possibility. It was so clearly expressed in Mr. Dombey's face that the Major apologised. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I see you are in earnest. I tell you what, Dombey." The Major paused in his eating, and looked mysteriously indignant. "That's a devilish ambitious woman, sir." Mr. Dombey said, "Indeed," with frigid indifference, mingled perhaps with some contemptuous incredulity as to Miss Tox having the presumption to harbour such a superior quality. "That woman, sir," said the Major, "is, in her way, a Lucifer. Joey B. has had his day, sir, but he keeps his eyes. He sees, does Joe. His Royal Highness the Duke of York observed of Joey at a levee that he saw." The Major accomplished this with such a look, and between eating, drinking hot tea, devilled grill, muffins, and meaning, was altogether so swollen and inflamed about the head, that even Mr. Dombey showed some anxiety for him. "That ridiculous old spectacle, sir," pursued the Major, "aspires. She aspires sky high, sir, matrimonially, Dombey." "I am sorry for her," said Mr. Dombey. "Don't say that, Dombey," returned the Major in a warning voice. "Why should I not, Major?" said Mr. Dombey. The Major gave no answer but the hoarsest cough, and went on eating vigorously. "She has taken an interest in your household," said the Major, stopping short again, "and has been a frequent visitor at your house for some time now." "Yes," replied Mr. Dombey, with great stateliness. "Miss Tox was originally received there, at the time of Mrs. Dombey's death, as a friend of my sister's, and being a well-behaved person, and showing a liking for the poor infant, she was permitted, I may say encouraged, to repeat her visits with my sister, and gradually to occupy a kind of footing of familiarity in the family. I have," said Mr. Dombey, in the tone of a man who was making a great and valuable concession, "I have a respect for Miss Tox. She has been so obliging as to render many little services in my house, trifling and insignificant services perhaps, Major, but not to be disparaged on that account. And I hope I have had the good fortune to be enabled to acknowledge them by such attention and notice as it has been in my power to bestow. I hold myself indebted to Miss Tox, Major," added Mr. Dombey, with a slight wave of his hand, "for the pleasure of your acquaintance." "Dombey," said the Major, warmly, "no, no, sir. Joseph Bagstock can never permit that assertion to pass uncontradicted. Your knowledge of old Joe, sir, such as he is, and old Joe's knowledge of you, sir, had its origin in a noble fellow, sir, in a great creature, sir, Dombey," said the Major, with a struggle which it was not very difficult to parade, his whole life being a struggle against all kinds of apoplectic symptoms. "We knew each other through your boy." Mr. Dombey seemed touched, as it is not improbable the Major designed he should be, by this allusion. He looked down and sighed, and the Major, rousing himself fiercely, again said, in reference to the state of mind into which he felt himself in danger of falling, that this was weakness, and nothing should induce him to submit to it. "Our friend has a remote connection with that event," said the Major, "and all the credit that belongs to her J.B. is willing to give her, sir. Notwithstanding which, ma'am," he added, raising his eyes from his plate, and casting them across Princess's Place to where Miss Tox was at the moment visible at her window watering her flowers, "you're a screaming jade, ma'am, and your ambition is a piece of monstrous impudence. If it only made yourself ridiculous, ma'am," said the Major, rolling his head at the unconscious Miss Tox, while his starting eyes appeared to make a leap towards her, "you might do that to your heart's content, ma'am, without any objection, I assure you, on the part of Bagstock." Here the Major laughed frightfully up in the tips of his ears and in the veins of his head. "But when, ma'am," said the Major, "you compromise other people, and generous, unsuspicious people too, as a repayment for their condescension, you stir the blood of old Joe in his body." "Major," said Mr. Dombey, reddening, "I hope you do not hint at anything so absurd on the part of Miss Tox as—" "Dombey," returned the Major, "I hint at nothing. But Joey B. has lived in the world, sir. I lived in the world with his eyes open, sir, and his ears cocked, and Joe tells you, Dombey, that there's a devilish artful and ambitious woman over the way." Mr. Dombey involuntarily glanced over the way, and an angry glance he sent in that direction too. "That's all on such a subject that shall pass the lips of Joseph Bagstock," said the Major, firmly. "Joe is not a tale-bearer, but there are times when he must speak, when he will speak. Confound your arts, ma'am," cried the Major, again apostrophising his fair neighbour with great ire, "when the provocation is too strong to admit of his remaining silent." The emotion of this outbreak threw the Major into a paroxysm of horse's coughs, which held him for a long time. On recovering, he added, "And now, Dombey, as you have invited Joe, old Joe, who has no other merits, sir, but that he is tough and hearty, to be your guest and guide at Leamington, command him in any way you please, and he is wholly yours. I don't know, sir," said the Major, wagging his double chin with a jocose air, "what it is you people see in Joe to make you hold him in such great request, all of you; but this I know, sir, that if he wasn't pretty tough and obstinate in his refusals, you'd kill him among you with your invitations and so forth, in double quick time." Mr. Dombey, in a few words, expressed his sense of the preference he received over those other distinguished members of society who were clamouring for the possession of Major Bagstock. But the Major cut him short by giving him to understand that he followed his own inclinations, and that they had risen up in a body, and said with one accord, "J. B. Dombey is the man for you to choose as a friend." The Major being by this time in a state of repletion, with essence of savoury pie oozing out at the corners of his eye, and devilled grill and kidneys tightening his cravat, and the time moreover approaching for the departure of the railway train to Birmingham, by which they were to leave town, the native got him into his greatcoat with immense difficulty, and buttoned him up until his face looked staring and gasping over the top of that garment as if he were in a barrel. The native then handed him separately, and with a decent interval between each supply, his wash leather gloves, his thick stick, and his hat, which latter article the Major wore with a rakish air on one side of his head, by way of toning down his remarkable visage. The native had previously packed in all possible and impossible parts of Mr. Dombey's chariot, which was in waiting, an unusual quantity of carpet-bags and small portmanteaus, no less apoplectic in appearance than the Major himself, and having filled his own pockets with seltzer water, East India sherry, sandwiches, shawls, telescopes, maps, and newspapers, any or all of which light baggage the Major might require at any instant of the journey, he announced that everything was ready. To complete the equipment of this unfortunate foreigner, currently believed to be a prince in his own country, when he took his seat in the rumble by the side of Mr. Towlinson, a pile of the Major's cloaks and greatcoats were hurled upon him by the landlord, who aimed at him from the pavement with those great missiles like a Titan, and so covered him up that he proceeded, in a living tomb, to the railroad station. But before the carriage moved away, and while the native was in the act of sepulture, Miss Tox, appearing at her window, waved a lily-white handkerchief. Mr. Dombey received this parting salutation very coldly even for him, and honouring her with the slightest possible inclination of his head, leaned back in the carriage with a very discontented look. His marked behaviour seemed to afford the Major, who was all politeness in his recognition of Miss Tox, unbounded satisfaction, and he sat for a long time afterwards, leering and choking like an overfed Mephistopheles. During the bustle of preparation at the railway, Mr. Dombey and the Major walked up and down the platform side by side, the former taciturn and gloomy, and the latter entertaining him, or entertaining himself, with a variety of anecdotes and reminiscences, in most of which Joe Bagstock was the principal performer. Neither of the two observed that in the course of these walks they attracted the attention of a working man who was standing near the engine, and who touched his hat every time they passed, for Mr. Dombey habitually looked over the vulgar herd, not at them, and the Major was looking, at the time, into the core of one of his stories. At length, however, this man stepped before them as they turned round, and pulling his hat off, and keeping it off, ducked his head to Mr. Dombey. "Beg your pardon, sir," said the man, "but I hope you're a-doing pretty well, sir." He was dressed in a canvas suit abundantly besmeared with coal dust and oil, and had cinders in his whiskers, and a smell of half-slaked ashes all over him. He was not a bad-looking fellow, nor even what could be fairly called a dirty-looking fellow, in spite of this; and, in short, he was Mr. Tootle, professionally clothed. "I shall have the honour of stoking you down, sir," said Mr. Tootle. "Beg your pardon, sir. I hope you find yourself a-coming round." Mr. Dombey looked at him, in return for his tone in interest, as if a man like that would make his very eyesight dirty. "'Scuse the liberty, sir," said Tootle, seeing he was not clearly remembered, "but my wife Polly, as was called Richards in your family." A change in Mr. Dombey's face, which seemed to express recollection of him, and so it did, but it expressed in a much stronger degree an angry sense of humiliation, stopped Mr. Tootle short. "Your wife wants money, I suppose," said Mr. Dombey, putting his hand in his pocket and speaking, but that he always did, haughtily. "No, thank you, sir," returned Tootle. "I can't say she does. I don't." Mr. Dombey was stopped short now in his turn, and awkwardly, with his hand in his pocket. "No, sir," said Tootle, turning his oilskin cap round and round. "We're doing pretty well, sir. We haven't no cause to complain in the worldly way, sir. We've had 4 more since then, sir, but we rubs on." Mr. Dombey would have rubbed on to his own carriage, though in so doing he had rubbed the stoker underneath the wheels, but his attention was arrested by something in connection with the cap still going slowly round and round in the man's hand. "We lost one babby," observed Tootle. "There's no denying." "Lately," added Mr. Dombey, looking at the cap. "No, sir, up to 3 years ago, but all the rest is hearty. And in the matter of reading, sir," said Tootle, ducking again, as if to remind Mr. Dombey of what had passed between them on that subject long ago, "them boys o' mine, they learned me, among 'em, after all. They're made a werry tolerable scholar of me, sir, them boys." "Come, Major," said Mr. Dombey. "Beg your pardon, sir," resumed Tootle, taking a step before them, and deferentially stopping them again, still cap in hand. "I wouldn't have troubled you with such a point, except as a way of getting in the name of my son Byler, christened Robin, him as you were so good as to make a charitable grinder on." "Well, man," said Mr. Dombey, in his severest manner, "what about him?" "Why, sir," returned Tootle, shaking his head with a face of great anxiety and distress, "I'm forced to say, sir, that he's gone wrong." "He has gone wrong, has he?" said Mr. Dombey, with a hard kind of satisfaction. "He has fell into bad company, you see, gentlemen," pursued the father, looking wistfully at both, and evidently taking the Major into the conversation with the hope of having his sympathy. "He has got into bad ways. God send he may come to again, gentlemen, but he's on the wrong track now. You could hardly be off hearing of it somehow, sir," said Tootle, again addressing Mr. Dombey individually, "and it's better I should out and say my boy's gone rather wrong. Polly's dreadful down about it, gentlemen," said Tootle, with the same dejected look, and another appeal to the Major. "A son of this man's whom I cause to be educated, Major," said Mr. Dombey, giving him his arm. "The usual return." "Take advice from plain old Joe, and never educate that sort of people, sir," returned the Major. "Damn me, sir, it never does. It always fails." The simple father was beginning to submit that he hoped his son, the quondam grinder, huffed and cuffed and flogged and badged and taught, as parrots are, by a brute jobbed into his place of schoolmaster with as much fitness for it as a hound, might not have been educated on quite a right plan in some undiscovered respect, when Mr. Dombey, angrily repeating "the usual return," led the Major away, and the Major, being heavy to hoist into Mr. Dombey's carriage, elevated in mid-air, and having to stop and swear that he would flay the native alive, and break every bone in his skin, and visit other physical torments upon him every time he couldn't get his foot on the step, and fell back on that dark exile, had barely time before they started to repeat hoarsely that it would never do, that it always failed, and that if he were to educate his own vagabond, he would certainly be hanged. Mr. Dombey assented bitterly, but there was something more in his bitterness, and in his moody way of falling back in the carriage, and looking with knitted brows at the changing objects without, than the failure of that noble educational system administered by the Grinders' Company. He had seen upon the man's rough cap a piece of new crape, and he had assured himself, from his manner and his answers, that he wore it for his son. So, from high to low, at home or abroad, from Florence in his great house to the coarse churl who was feeding the fire then smoking before them, every one set up some claim or other to a share in his dead boy, and was a bidder against him. Could he ever forget how that woman had wept over his pillow, called him her own child, or how he, waking from his sleep, had asked for her, and had raised himself in his bed and brightened when she came in? To think of this presumptuous raker among coals and ashes going on before there, with his sign of mourning. To think that he dared to enter, even by a common show like that, into the trial and disappointment of a proud gentleman's secret heart. To think that this lost child, who was to have divided with him his riches and his projects and his power, and allied with whom he was to have shut out all the world as with a double door of gold, should have let in such a herd to insult him with their knowledge of his defeated hopes, and their boasts of claiming community of feeling with himself, so far removed, if not of having crept into the place wherein he would have lorded it alone. He found no pleasure or relief in the journey. Tortured by these thoughts, he carried monotony with him through the rushing landscape, and hurried headlong, not through a rich and varied country, but a wilderness of blighted plans and gnawing jealousies. The very speed at which the train was whirled along mocked the swift course of the young life that had been borne away so steadily and so inexorably to its foredoomed end. The power that forced itself upon its iron way, its own, defiant of all paths and roads, piercing through the heart of every obstacle, and dragging living creatures of all classes, ages, degrees behind it, was a type of the triumphant monster, Death. Away, with a shriek and a roar and a rattle from the town, burrowing among the dwellings of men and making the streets hum, flashing out into the meadows for a moment, mining it through the damp earth, booming on in darkness and heavy air, bursting out again into the sunny day so bright and wide. Away, with a shriek and a roar and a rattle, through the fields, through the woods, through the corn, through the hay, through the chalk, through the mould, through the clay, through the rock, among objects close at hand and almost in the grasp, ever flying from the traveller, and a deceitful distance ever moving slowly within him, like as in the track of the remorseless monster, Death. Through the hollow, on the height, by the heath, by the orchard, by the park, by the garden, over the canal, across the river, where the sheep are feeding, where the mill is going, where the barge is floating, where the dead are lying, where the factory is smoking, where the stream is running, where the village clusters, where the great cathedral rises, where the bleak moor lies, and the wild breeze smooths or ruffles it as at its inconstant will, away, with a shriek and a roar and a rattle, and no trace to leave behind but dust and vapour, like as in the track of the remorseless monster, Death. Breasting the wind and light, the shower and sunshine, away and still away, it rolls and roars, fierce and rapid, smooth and certain, and great works and massive bridges crossing up above fall like a beam of shadow an inch broad upon the eye, and then are lost. Away and still away, onward and onward ever. Glimpses of cottage homes, of houses, mansions, rich estates, of husbandry and handicraft, of people, of old road and paths that look deserted, small and insignificant as they are left behind, and so they do, and what else is there but such glimpses in the track of the indomitable monster, Death. Away with a shriek and a roar and a rattle, plunging down into the earth again, and working on in such a storm of energy and perseverance that amidst the darkness and whirlwind the motion seems reversed, and to tend furiously backward, until a ray of light upon the wet wall shows its surface flying past like a fierce stream. Away once more into the day and through the day, with a shrill yell of exultation, roaring, rattling, tearing on, spurning everything with its dark breath, sometimes pausing for a minute where a crowd of faces are, that in a minute more are not, sometimes lapping water greedily, and before the spout at which it drinks has ceased to drip upon the ground, shrieking, roaring, rattling through the purple distance. Louder and louder yet, it shrieks and cries as it comes tearing on, resistless to the goal, and now its way, still like the way of death, is strewn with ashes thickly. Everything around is blackened. There are dark pools of water, muddy lanes, and miserable habitations far below. There are jagged walls and falling houses close at hand, and through the battered roofs and broken windows wretched rooms are seen, where want and fever hide themselves in many wretched shapes, while smoke and crowded gables and distorted chimneys and deformity of brick and mortar, penning up deformity of mind and body, choke the murky distance. As Mr. Dombey looks out of his carriage window, it is never in his thoughts that the monster who has brought him there has let the light of day in on these things, not made or caused them. It was the journey's fitting end, and might have been the end of everything. It was so ruinous and dreary. So, pursuing the one course of thought, he had the one relentless monster still before him. All things looked black and cold and deadly upon him, and he on them. He found a likeness to his misfortune everywhere. There was a remorseless triumph going on about him, and it galled and stung him in his pride and jealousy, whatever form it took, though most of all when it divided with him the love and memory of his lost boy. There was a face, he had looked upon it on the previous night, and it on him with eyes that read his soul, though they were dim with tears and hidden soon behind two quivering hands that often had attended him in fancy on this ride. He had seen it with the expression of last night, timidly pleading to him. It was not reproachful, but there was something of doubt, almost of hopeless incredulity in it, which, as he once more saw that fade away into a desolate certainty of his dislike, was like reproach. It was a trouble to him to think of this face of Florence. Because he felt any new compunction toward it? No. Because the feeling it awakened in him, of which he had had some old foreshadowing in older times, was full formed now, and spoke out plainly, moving him too much, and threatening to grow too strong for his composure. Because the face was abroad in the expression of defeat and persecution that seemed to encircle him like the air. Because it barbed the arrow of that cruel and remorseless enemy on which his thoughts so ran, and put into its grasp a double-headed sword. Because he knew full well in his own breast as he stood there, tinging the scene of transition before him with the morbid colours of his own mind, and making it a ruin and a picture of decay instead of hopeful change, and promise of better things, that life had quite as much to do with his complainings as death. One child was gone, and one child left. Why was the object of his hope removed instead of her? The sweet, calm, gentle presence in his fancy moved him to no reflection but that. She had been unwelcome to him from the first. She was an aggravation of his bitterness now. If his son had been his only child, and the same blow had fallen on him, it would have been heavy to bear, but infinitely lighter than now, when it might have fallen on her, whom he could have lost, or he believed it, without a pang, and had not. Her loving and innocent face rising before him had no softening or winning influence. He rejected the angel, and took up with the tormenting spirit crouching in his bosom. Her patience, goodness, youth, devotion, love, were as so many atoms in the ashes upon which he set his heel. He saw her image in the blight and blackness all around him, not irradiating, but deepening the gloom. More than once upon this journey, and now again as he stood pondering at this journey's end, tracing figures in the dust with his stick, the thought came into his mind, what was there he could interpose between himself and it? The Major, who had been blowing and panting all the way down, like another engine, and whose eye had often wandered from his newspaper to leer at the prospect, as if there were a procession of discomfited Miss Toxes pouring out in the smoke of the train, and flying away over the fields to hide themselves in any place of refuge, aroused his friend by informing him that the post-horses were harnessed and the carriage ready. "Dombey," said the Major, rapping him on the arm with his cane, "don't be thoughtful. It's a bad habit. Old Joe, sir, wouldn't be as tough as you see him if he had ever encouraged it. You are too great a man, Dombey, to be thoughtful. In your position, sir, you're far above that kind of thing." The Major, even in his friendly remonstrances, thus consulting the dignity and honour of Mr. Dombey, and showing a lively sense of their importance, Mr. Dombey felt more than ever disposed to defer to a gentleman possessing so much good sense and such a well-regulated mind. Accordingly, he made an effort to listen to the Major's stories as they trotted along the turnpike road, and the Major, finding both the pace and the road a great deal better adapted to his conversational powers than the mode of travelling they had just relinquished, came out for his entertainment. But still the Major, blunt and tough as he was, and as he so very often said he was, administered some palatable catering to his companion's appetite. He related, or rather suffered it to escape him, accidentally, and as one might say grudgingly and against his will, how there was a great curiosity and excitement at the club in regard to his friend Dombey. How he was suffocated with questions, sir. How old Joe Bagstock was a greater man than ever on the strength of Dombey. How they said, "Bagstock, your friend Dombey now, what is the view he takes of such and such a question?" "Though by the rood, sir," said the Major, with a broad stare, "how they discovered that J.B. ever came to know you is a mystery." In this flow of spirits and conversation, only interrupted by his usual plethoric symptoms, and by intervals of lunch, and from time to time by some violent assault upon the native, who wore a pair of earrings in his dark brown ears, and on whom his European clothes sat with an outlandish impossibility of adjustment, being, of their own accord, and without any reference to the tailor's art, long where they ought to be short, short where they ought to be long, tight where they ought to be loose, and loose where they ought to be tight, and to which he imparted a new grace whenever the Major attacked him, by shrinking into them like a shrivelled nut, or a cold monkey. In this flow of spirits and conversation the Major continued all day, so that when evening came on, and found them trotting through the green and leafy road near Leamington, the Major's voice, what with talking and eating and chuckling and choking, appeared to be in the box under the rumble, or in some neighbouring haystack. Nor did the Major improve it at the Royal Hotel, where rooms and dinner had been ordered, and where he so oppressed his organs of speech by eating and drinking, that when he retired to bed he had no voice at all, except to cough with, and could only make himself intelligible to that dark servant by gasping at him. He not only rose next morning, however, like a giant refreshed, but conducted himself at breakfast like a giant refreshing. At this meal they arranged their daily habits. The Major was to take the responsibility of ordering everything to eat and drink, and they were to have a late breakfast together every morning, and a late dinner together every day. Mr. Dombey would prefer remaining in his own room, or walking in the country by himself on that first day of their sojourn at Leamington, but next morning he would be happy to accompany the Major to the pump room and about the town. So they parted until dinner time. Mr. Dombey retired to nurse his wholesome thoughts in his own way. The Major, attended by the native carrying a camp stool, a greatcoat, and an umbrella, swaggered up and down through all the public places, looking into subscription books to find out who was there, looking up old ladies by whom he was much admired, reporting J.B. tougher than ever, and puffing his rich friend Dombey wherever he went. There never was a man who stood by a friend more staunchly than the Major, when, in puffing him, he puffed himself. It was surprising how much new conversation the Major had to let off at dinner time, and what occasion he gave Mr. Dombey to admire his social qualities. At breakfast next morning he knew the contents of the latest newspapers received, and mentioned several subjects in connection with them, on which his opinion had recently been sought by persons of such power and might that they were only to be obscurely hinted at. Mr. Dombey, who had been so long shut up within himself, and who had rarely at any time overstepped the enchanted circle within which the operations on Dombey and Son were conducted, began to think this an improvement on his solitary life, and in place of excusing himself for another day, as he had thought of doing when alone, walked out with the Major arm in arm. End of chapter 20.
Chapter 21 of Dombey and Son. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Dombey and Son by Charles Dickens. Recording by Cynthia Lyons. Chapter 21. New Faces. The Major, more blue-faced and staring, more overripe, as it were, than ever, and giving vent every now and then to one of the hoarsest coughs, not so much of necessity as in a spontaneous explosion of importance, walked arm in arm with Mr. Dombey up the sunny side of the way, with his cheeks swelling over his tight stock, his legs majestically wide apart, and his great head wagging from side to side, as if he were remonstrating within himself for being such a captivating object. They had not walked many yards before the Major encountered somebody he knew, nor many yards farther before the Major encountered somebody else he knew, but he merely shook his fingers at them as he passed, and led Mr. Dombey on, pointing out the localities as they went, and enlivening the walk with any current scandal suggested by them. In this manner the Major and Mr. Dombey were walking arm in arm, much to their own satisfaction, when they beheld advancing towards them a wheeled chair, in which a lady was seated, indolently steering her carriage by a kind of rudder in front, while it was propelled by some unseen power in the rear. Although the lady was not young, she was very blooming in the face, quite rosy, and her dress and attitude were perfectly juvenile. Walking by the side of the chair, and carrying her gossamer parasol with a proud and weary air, as if so great an effort must be soon abandoned, and the parasol dropped, sauntered a much younger lady, very handsome, very haughty, very wilful, who tossed her head and drooped her eyelids, as though if there were anything in all the world worth looking into, save a mirror, it certainly was not the earth or sky. "Why, what the devil have we here, sir?" cried the Major, stopping as this little cavalcade drew near. "My dearest Edith," drawled the lady in the chair. "Major Bagstock." The Major no sooner heard the voice than he relinquished Mr. Dombey's arm, darted forward, took the hand of the lady in the chair, and pressed it to his lips. With no less gallantry, the Major folded both his gloves upon his heart, and bowed low to the other lady. And now, the chair having stopped, the motive power became visible in the shape of a flushed page pushing behind, who seemed to have in part outgrown and in part outpushed his strength. For when he stood upright he was tall and wan and thin, and his plight appeared the more forlorn from his having injured the shape of his hat by butting at the carriage with his head to urge it forward, as is sometimes done by elephants in Oriental countries. "Joe Bagstock," said the Major to both ladies, "is a proud and happy man for the rest of his life." "You false creature," said the old lady in the chair, insipidly. "Where do you come from? I can't bear you." "Then suffer old Joe to present a friend, ma'am," said the Major, promptly, "as a reason for being tolerated. Mr. Dombey, Mrs. Skewton." The lady in the chair was gracious. "Mr. Dombey, Mrs. Granger." The lady with the parasol was faintly conscious of Mr. Dombey's taking off his hat and bowing low. "I am delighted, sir," said the Major, "to have this opportunity." The Major seemed in earnest, for he looked at all the three and leered in his ugliest manner. "Mrs. Skewton, Dombey," said the Major, "makes havoc in the heart of old Josh." Mr. Dombey signified that he didn't wonder at it. "You perfidious goblin," said the lady in the chair. "Have done. How long have you been here, bad man?" "1 day," replied the Major. "And can you be a day, or even a minute?" returned the lady, slightly settling her false curls and false eyebrows with her fan, and showing her false teeth, set off by her false complexion. "In the garden of what's-its-name?" "Eden, I suppose, mamma," interrupted the younger lady, scornfully. "My dear Edith," said the other, "I cannot help it. I can never remember those frightful names without having your whole soul and being inspired by the sight of nature, by the perfume," said Mrs. Skewton, rustling a handkerchief that was faint and sticky with essences, "of her artless breath, you creature." The discrepancy between Mrs. Skewton's fresh enthusiasm of words and forlornly faded manner was hardly less observable than that between her age, which was about 70, and her dress, which would have been youthful for 27. Her attitude in the wheeled chair, which she never varied, was one in which she had been taken in a barouche some 50 years before by a then fashionable artist who had appended to his published sketch the name of Cleopatra, in consequence of a discovery made by the critics of the time, that it bore an exact resemblance to that princess as she reclined on board her galley. Mrs. Skewton was a beauty then, and bucks threw wine glasses over their heads by dozens in her honour. The beauty and the barouche had both passed away, but she still preserved the attitude, and for this reason expressly maintained the wheeled chair and the butting page, then there being nothing whatever, except the attitude, to prevent her from walking. "Mr. Dombey is devoted to nature, I trust," said Mrs. Skewton, settling her diamond brooch. And, by the way, she chiefly lived upon the reputation of some diamonds, and her family connections. "My friend Dombey, ma'am," returned the Major, "may be devoted to her in secret, but a man who is paramount in the greatest city in the universe—" "No one can be a stranger," said Mrs. Skewton, "to Mr. Dombey's immense influence." As Mr. Dombey acknowledged the compliment with a bend of his head, the younger lady, glancing at him, met his eyes. "You reside here, madam?" said Mr. Dombey, addressing her. "No, we have been to a great many places, to Harrogate and Scarborough, and into Devonshire. We have been visiting, and resting here and there. Mamma likes change." "Edith, of course, does not," said Mrs. Skewton, with a ghastly archness. "I have not found that there is any change in such places," was the answer, delivered with supreme indifference. "They libel me. There is only one change, Mr. Dombey," observed Mrs. Skewton, with a mincing sigh, "for which I really care, and that, I fear, I shall never be permitted to enjoy. People cannot spare one, but seclusion and contemplation are my what's-his-name." "If you mean paradise, mamma, you had better say so, to render yourself intelligible," said the younger lady. "My dearest Edith," returned Mrs. Skewton, "you know that I am wholly dependent upon you for those odious names. I assure you, Mr. Dombey, nature intended me for an Arcadian. I am thrown away in society. Cows are my passion. What I have ever sighed for has been to retreat to a Swiss farm, and live entirely surrounded by cows and china." This curious association of objects, suggesting a remembrance of the celebrated bull who got by mistake into a crockery shop, was received with perfect gravity by Mr. Dombey, who intimated his opinion that nature was, no doubt, a very respectable institution. "What I want," drawled Mrs. Skewton, pinching her shrivelled throat, "is heart." It was frightfully true in one sense, if not in that in which she used the phrase. "What I want is frankness, confidence, less conventionality, and freer play of soul. We are dreadfully artificial." We were, indeed. "In short," said Mrs. Skewton, "I want nature everywhere. It would be so extremely charming." "Nature is inviting us away now, mamma, if you are ready," said the younger lady, curling her handsome lip. At this hint, the wan page, who had been surveying the party over the top of the chair, vanished behind it, as if the ground had swallowed him up. "Stop a moment, Withers," said Mrs. Skewton, as the chair began to move, calling to the page with all the languid dignity with which she had called in days of yore to a coachman with a wig, cauliflower nosegay, and silk stockings. "Where are you staying? Abomination!" The Major was staying at the Royal Hotel with his friend Dombey. "You may come and see us any evening when you are good," lisped Mrs. Skewton. "If Mr. Dombey will honour us, we shall be happy. Withers, go on." The Major again pressed to his blue lips the tips of the fingers that were disposed on the ledge of the wheeled chair with careful carelessness, after the Cleopatra model, and Mr. Dombey bowed. The elder lady honoured them both with a very gracious smile and a girlish wave of her hand, the younger lady with the very slightest inclination of her head that common courtesy allowed. the last glimpse of the wrinkled face of the mother, with that patched colour on it which the sun made infinitely more haggard and dismal than any want of colour could have been, and of the proud beauty of the daughter, with her graceful figure and erect deportment, engendered such an involuntary disposition on the part of both the Major and Mr. Dombey to look after them, that they both turned at the same moment. The page, nearly as much aslant as his own shadow, was toiling after the chair, uphill, like a slow battering-ram. The top of Cleopatra's bonnet was fluttering in exactly the same corner to the inch as before, and the beauty, loitering by herself a little in advance, expressed in all her elegant form, from head to foot, the same supreme disregard of everything and everybody. "I tell you what, sir," said the Major, as they resumed their walk again. "If Joe Bagstock were a younger man, there's not a woman in the world whom he'd prefer for Mrs. Bagstock to that woman. By George, sir," said the Major, "she's superb!" "Do you mean the daughter?" inquired Mr. Dombey. "Is Joey B. a turnip, Dombey?" said the Major, "that he should mean the mother?" "You were complimentary to the mother," returned Mr. Dombey. "An ancient flame, sir," chuckled Major Bagstock. "Devilish ancient. I humour her." "She impresses me as being perfectly genteel," said Mr. Dombey. "Genteel, sir," said the Major, stopping short, and staring in his companion's face. "The Honourable Mrs. Skewton, sir, is sister to the late Lord Phoenix, and aunt to the present lord. The family are not wealthy. They're poor, indeed, and she lives upon a small jointure. But if you come to blood, sir—" The Major gave a flourish with his stick and walked on again, in despair of being able to say what you came to, if you came to that. "You addressed the daughter, I observed," said Mr. Dombey, after a short pause, "as Mrs. Granger." "Edith Skewton, sir," returned the Major, stopping short again, and punching a mark in the ground with his cane to represent her. "Married at 18, Granger of Ouse," whom the Major indicated by another punch. "Granger, sir," said the Major, tapping the last ideal portrait, and rolling his head emphatically, "was Colonel of Ouse, a devilish handsome fellow, sir, of 41. He died, sir, in the second year of his marriage." The Major ran the representative of the deceased Granger through and through the body with his walking stick, and went on again, carrying the stick over his shoulder. "How long is this ago?" asked Mr. Dombey, making another halt. "Edith Granger, sir," replied the Major, shutting one eye, putting his head on one side, passing his cane into his left hand, and smoothing his shirt frill with his right, "is at the present time not quite 30. And damme, sir," said the Major, shouldering his stick once more, and walking on again, "she's a peerless woman." "Was there any family?" asked Mr. Dombey, presently. "Yes, sir," said the Major. "There was a boy." Mr. Dombey's eyes sought the ground, and a shade came over his face. "Who was drowned, sir," pursued the Major, "when a child of 4 or 5 years old." "Indeed!" said Mr. Dombey, raising his head. "By the upsetting of a boat, in which his nurse had no business to have put him," said the Major. "That's his history. Edith Granger is Edith Granger still; but if tough old Joey B., sir, were a little younger and a little richer, the name of that immortal paragon should be Bagstock." The Major heaved his shoulders and his cheeks, and laughed more like an overfed Mephistopheles than ever as he said the words. "Provided the lady made no objection, I suppose,"
said Mr. Dombey, coldly. "By gad, sir," said the Major, "the Bagstock breed are not accustomed to that sort of obstacle; though it's true enough that Edith might have married 20 times, but for being proud, sir, proud." Mr. Dombey seemed by his face to think no worse of her for that. "It's a great quality after all," said the Major. "By the Lord, it's a high quality. Dombey, you are proud yourself, and your friend, old Joe, respects you for it, sir." With this tribute to the character of his ally, which seemed to be wrung from him by the force of circumstances and the irresistible tendency of their conversation, the Major closed the subject, and glided into a general exposition of the extent to which he had been beloved and doted on by splendid women and brilliant creatures. On the next day but one, Mr. Dombey and the Major encountered the Honourable Mrs. Skewton and her daughter in the pump room. On the day after, they met them again, very near the place where they had met them first. After meeting them thus 3 or 4 times in all, it became a point of mere civility to old acquaintances that the Major should go there one evening. Mr. Dombey had not originally intended to pay visits, but on the Major announcing this intention, he said he would have the pleasure of accompanying him. So the Major told the native to go round before dinner and say, with his and Mr. Dombey's compliments, that they would have the honour of visiting the ladies that same evening, if the ladies were alone. In answer to which message, the native brought back a very small note, with a very large quantity of scent about it, indited by the Honourable Mrs. Skewton to Major Bagstock, and briefly saying, "You are a shocking bear, and I have a great mind not to forgive you, but if you are very good indeed," which was underlined, "you may come. Compliments," in which Edith unites to Mr. Dombey. The Honourable Mrs. Skewton and her daughter, Mrs. Granger, resided, while at Leamington, in lodgings that were fashionable enough and dear enough, but rather limited in point of space and conveniences, so that the Honourable Mrs. Skewton, being in bed, had her feet in the window and her head in the fireplace, while the Honourable Mrs. Skewton's maid was quartered in a closet within the drawing-room, so extremely small that, to avoid developing the whole of its accommodations, she was obliged to writhe in and out of the door like a beautiful serpent. Withers, the wan page, slept out of the house immediately under the tiles at a neighbouring milk shop, and the wheeled chair, which was the stone of that young Sisyphus, passed the night in a shed belonging to the same dairy, where new-laid eggs were produced by the poultry connected with the establishment, who roosted on a broken donkey cart, persuaded, to all appearances, that it grew there, and was a species of tree. Mr. Dombey and the Major found Mrs. Skewton arranged as Cleopatra among the cushions of a sofa, very airily dressed, and certainly not resembling Shakespeare's Cleopatra, whom age could not wither. On the way upstairs they had heard the sound of a harp, but it had ceased on their being announced, and Edith now stood beside it, handsomer and haughtier than ever. It was a remarkable characteristic of this lady's beauty that it appeared to vaunt and assert itself without her aid and against her will. She knew that she was beautiful. It was impossible that it could be otherwise, but she seemed with her own pride to defy her very self. Whether she held cheap attractions that could only call forth admiration that was worthless to her, or whether she designed to render them more precious to admirers by this usage of them, those to whom they were precious seldom paused to consider. "I hope, Mrs. Granger," said Mr. Dombey, advancing a step towards her, "we are not the cause of your ceasing to play." "You? Oh, no."
"Why do you not go on then, my dearest Edith?" said Cleopatra. "I left off as I began, of my own fancy." The exquisite indifference of her manner in saying this, an indifference quite removed from dullness or insensibility, for it was pointed with proud purpose, was well set off by the carelessness with which she drew her hand across the strings, and came from that part of the room. "Do you know, Mr. Dombey," said her languishing mother, playing with a hand screen, "that occasionally my dearest Edith and myself actually almost differ?" "Not quite sometimes, mamma," said Edith. "Oh, never quite, my darling. Fie, fie, it would break my heart," returned her mother, making a faint attempt to pat her with the screen, which Edith made no movement to meet, "about these cold conventionalities of manner that are observed in little things. Why are we not more natural? Dear me! With all those yearnings and gushings and impulsive throbbings that we have implanted in our souls, and which are so very charming, why are we not more natural?" Mr. Dombey said it was very true, very true. "We could be more natural, I suppose, if we tried," said Mrs. Skewton. Mr. Dombey thought it possible. "Devil a bit, ma'am," said the Major. "We couldn't afford it, unless the world was peopled with J.B.'s, tough and blunt old Joes, ma'am, plain red herrings with hard roes, sir. We couldn't afford it. It wouldn't do." "You naughty infidel," said Mrs. Skewton. "Be mute." "Cleopatra commands," returned the Major, kissing his hand, "and Antony Bagstock obeys." "The man has no sensitiveness," said Mrs. Skewton, cruelly holding up the hand screen so as to shut the Major out. "No sympathy. And what do we live for but sympathy? What else is so extremely charming? Without that gleam of sunshine on our cold, cold earth," said Mrs. Skewton, arranging her lace tucker, and complacently observing the effect on her bare lean arm, looking upward from the wrist, "how could we possibly bear it? In short, obdurate man," glancing at the Major round the screen, "I would have my world all heart, and faith is so excessively charming, that I won't allow you to disturb it. Do you hear?" The Major replied that it was hard in Cleopatra to require the world to be all heart, and yet to appropriate to herself the hearts of all the world, which obliged Cleopatra to remind him that flattery was insupportable to her, and that if he had the boldness to address her in that strain any more, she would positively send him home. Withers the wan, at this period, handing round the tea, Mr. Dombey again addressed himself to Edith. "There is not much company here, it would seem," said Mr. Dombey, in his own portentous, gentlemanly way. "I believe not. We see none." "Why, really," observed Mrs. Skewton from her couch, "there are no people here just now with whom we care to associate." "They have not enough heart," said Edith, with a smile. The very twilight of a smile, so singularly were its light and darkness blended. "My dearest Edith rallies me, you see," said her mother, shaking her head, which shook a little of itself sometimes, as if the palsy twinkled now and then in opposition to the diamonds. "Wicked one!" "You have been here before, if I am not mistaken," said Mr. Dombey, still to Edith. "Oh, several times. I think we have been everywhere." "A beautiful country." "I suppose it is. Everybody says so." "Your cousin Phoenix raves about it, Edith," interposed her mother from her couch. The daughter slightly turned her graceful head, and raising her eyebrows by a hair's breadth, as if her cousin Phoenix were of all the mortal world the least to be regarded, turned her eyes again towards Mr. Dombey. "I hope, for the credit of my good taste, that I am tired of the neighbourhood," she said. "You have almost reason to be, madam," he replied, glancing at a variety of landscape drawings, of which he had already recognised several as representing neighbouring points of view, and which were strewn abundantly about the room. "If these beautiful productions are from your hand." She gave him no reply, but sat in disdainful beauty, quite amazing. "Have they that interest?" said Mr. Dombey. "Are they yours?" "Yes." "And you play, I already know." "Yes." "And sing?" "Yes." She answered all these questions with a strange reluctance, and with that remarkable air of opposition to herself, already noticed as belonging to her beauty. Yet she was not embarrassed, but wholly self-possessed. Neither did she seem to wish to avoid the conversation, for she addressed her face, and, so far as she could, her manner also, to him, and continued to do so when he was silent. "You have many resources against weariness, at least," said Mr. Dombey. "Whatever their efficiency may be," she returned, "you know them all now. I have no more." "May I hope to prove them all?" said Mr. Dombey, with solemn gallantry, laying down a drawing he had held, and motioning towards the harp. "Oh, certainly, if you desire it." She rose as she spoke, and crossing by her mother's couch, and directing a stately look towards her, which was instantaneous in its duration, but inclusive, if anyone had seen it, of a multitude of expressions, among which that of the twilight smile, without the smile itself, overshadowed all the rest, went out of the room. The Major, who was quite forgiven by this time, had wheeled a little table up to Cleopatra, and was sitting down to play piquet with her. Mr. Dombey, not knowing the game, sat down to watch them for his edification until Edith should return. "We are going to have some music, Mr. Dombey, I hope," said Cleopatra. "Mrs. Granger has been kind enough to promise so." "Ah! That's very nice. Do you propose, Major?" "No, ma'am," said the Major. "Couldn't do it." "You are a barbarous being," replied the lady, "and my hand's destroyed. You are fond of music, Mr. Dombey?" "Eminently so," was Mr. Dombey's answer. "Yes, it's very nice," said Cleopatra, looking at her cards. "So much heart in it, undeveloped recollections of a previous state of existence, and all that, which is so truly charming. Do you know," simpered Cleopatra, reversing the knave of clubs, who had come into her game with heels uppermost, "that if anything could tempt me to put a period to my life, it would be curiosity to find out what it's all about, and what it means. There are so many provoking mysteries, really, that are hidden from us. Major, you to play." The Major played, and Mr. Dombey, looking on for his instruction, would soon have been in a state of dire confusion, but that he gave no attention to the game whatever, and sat wondering instead when Edith would come back. She came at last, and sat down to her harp, and Mr. Dombey rose and stood beside her, listening. He had little taste for music, and no knowledge of the strain she played, but he saw her bending over it, and perhaps he heard among the sounding strings some distant music of his own that tamed the monster of the iron road, and made it less inexorable. Cleopatra had a sharp eye, verily, at piquet. It glistened like a bird's, and did not fix itself upon the game, but pierced the room from end to end, and gleamed on harp, performer, listener, everything. When the haughty beauty had concluded, she arose, and receiving Mr. Dombey's thanks and compliments in exactly the same manner as before, went with scarcely any pause to the piano, and began there. Edith Granger, any song but that. Edith Granger, you are very handsome, and your touch upon the keys is brilliant, and your voice is deep and rich, but not the air that his neglected daughter sang to his dead son. Alas, he knows it not, and if he did, What air of hers would stir him, rigid man? Sleep, lonely Florence, sleep. Peace in thy dreams, although the night has turned dark, and the clouds are gathering, and threaten to discharge themselves in hail. End of chapter 21.